itself is in a circle, and then I'll draw it in a different color. There is a target zone in the middle that's a circle. On the device, it's actually a black ring. Get that. It's actually a black ring, and then you'll see a bubble floating in here. Right now, this one's floating way over here. Okay? There are 3 legs on the device, 3 adjustable legs. They're right here, here, and right in the middle on this side. So up here, we're going to say they're right here, here, and here. So I've got 3 adjustments I can make, and I've got a bubble that's floating in space that has to be neutral. So the easiest thing that I like to do is start with this side, and obviously this is the high side, the bubble is on this side, that means this is high, that means this needs to go down or this needs to go up. So I'm going to look at here, and in this case this one needs to go down a good bit. So I'm going to pick this up with your fingers. That makes it easy to adjust it. I can drop it down, still high. That's a little bit better. On this side, I'm going to bring it up a little bit. This is kind of like sighting in a rifle. At this point, what I want to do is I want to move that bubble so that it comes across this line. By adjusting these 2, I want to put this bubble right up here. Notice it's still not in the ring, but now it's at least on this plane. The next one I'm going to adjust is this one. In this case, this one would be high. So these 2 both would have to go down, or this one would have, these 2 both would have to come up, or this one would have to go down. In this case, it would be easier to just drop that one. Here, what I've got is I'm just a little bit high on this side. So I'm going to pick it up and drop it a little bit. Now, if you have a question about whether it's going the right direction or which direction is the right direction, this desk is way off. So I'm going to take both of these up a little bit. Try it and see. If you're not sure, try it and look where the bubble goes and then adjust accordingly. Okay, so now the main thing is at the end of this process, this will be level. If it's not level, it cannot work. The next thing we want to do is put oil in this cylinder. Here's our reservoir, here's a valve, here's the cylinder. So in order to put oil in this cylinder, I have to open this valve. So I'm going to open this valve, and then I'm going to back this out, going counterclockwise, and you should see the oil drop as I do this. And you don't want to get in a big rush. If you take it out too fast, you just have to wait on it anyway. So I want to take it out. That's plenty far. It'll stop. It stopped right there.
You can't screw it all out?
No, you shouldn't be able to take it all out. You don't have to put pressure on this thing. It's fairly easy. And then once I've got this cylinder filled with oil, I'm going to close this valve. What that'll do is right now, if I turn in on this, it's going to build pressure inside this chamber. This valve has to be open so that I can point it to the piston. The piston that we're actually working with is actually underneath here. So I open this valve. Once this valve is open, then the oil side of it is already set up. We're done with the setup on that. The next question is weight. If I've got, this gauge is a 0 to 30 PSI gauge. There is a graph right here. On that graph there's two charts. There's one for a 20th and there's one for a 100th. I will go ahead and tell you that this is for the 100th. The piston that's in here is for the 100th. We can swap the piston out to either one of those. The one that's in here is a 100th. So if I go across here, let's say I want to put 10 PSI on this gauge. I go across and I see 10, and 10 is a WG223. That means I need a weight that's labeled WG223. Everything here is a weight. They all have labels on it. There's a WG23. There's a 225. .232, not 223. So this is a WG232. It is on the edge. It's engraved in the edge. I put this right there. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to start adding pressure by screwing this in. We have 4 lines right here. I want to look at this bottom edge as my reference, and I want it above the top 2 lines and below the bottom 2. Or above the bottom 2 and below the top 2. So as I add pressure to this, there it goes. Now it's floating right where it's supposed to be. Notice I didn't look at the gauge. Why didn't I look at the gauge?
Because it could be wrong.
Yeah, the gauge could be wrong. We're testing the gauge to see if the gauge is right. So I don't look at the gauge at this point. If I look at that gauge and try to make that gauge hit 10 PSI, I can do that. But that's not what we're after. We want to make sure that I have 10 PSI applied to the gauge. And now the gauge says I've got 5, 6, 7, 8 PSI on it. So the gauge is wrong. Okay? That's what we're trying to find out. Is the gauge right or is it wrong? That's the charts that you build. So let's put 50% on this. That would be 15 PSI. Now I can leave that just like that. Since this was 10 PSI, I now need something that's going to be 2.5 PSI. So if I go down here, I have a half PSI, which is a WG234. This is not it. I've got more weights over here, and if I look at this, there's a 230, 230, 234. This guy right here, he fits right there in the top. So I just added a half PSI to that. So now I've got 10.5, but I want 15. Ooh, that's not going to work. Wrong one. I wanted a WG230, which is going to be 1 PSI. So there's the 230. There's 1 PSI. Now I need 4 PSI more. Well, in this case, I can use a 233, which is a half, or is 5 PSI. So there's 232, 231, 233. This is 5 PSI. 10 and 5 is 15. Double check. Now I'm going to have to jack this up a little bit more because we added pressure to it. Now it's hovering. Now I should have mid-scale on here, and you can see the gauge is really off. I'm showing 10 PSI on the gauge, roughly. and I've got 15 psi applied to it. So that's how it works. And you go through this, you pick out your weights, put the weights on there, add pressure to it, check your gauge. When you're done checking the gauge, if we're done with the calibration, now we need to put it up. So the first thing I'm going to do is put the weights back in place.
So you did all that to make sure the gauge was working, but it's not working. So
Right.
You have to take the gauge off and do what you
Now we would have to do the adjustments to the gauge that we talked about all the way before, those adjustments that we talked about. And I'm not going to make y'all do that because it's very tedious, it takes a lot of time, and the other thing is you won't do that in the mills. It's not going to happen. You get a new gauge.
Maintenance?
Sir?
Is that
Ma'am?
what the maintenance does?
But that's what y'all are training to do is maintenance.
I'm talking about doing the calibration on the thing that you said we won't have to do in the bid. We won't have to do that?
You won't have to do it because you'll throw it away and get a new gauge.
What's that thing called? The
Deadweight tester.
Deadweight.
This is a deadweight tester. So I want to put all my weights back on. That one goes there. That keeps those on. Now, this is blind. If you've got it level, it's straight down, it's pretty easy to get it. If you can't see it, then pick these up and kind of get a view of it. The next thing is I need to get the oil out of here and back into the reservoir. So I open this valve, or excuse me, I close this valve. Let me take the pressure off of it first. Take the pressure off of it. Close this valve. Now I open this valve. And run this back in, and as I run this back in, it's going to force the oil back up into the reservoir. Once the oil is in the reservoir, I can close this valve, and now it's safe to take wherever I want to take it. Any questions about that? Pretty simple operation. There are different styles of deadweight tester. This one, we've got the screw jack on it. Some of them have a hand pump where you just pump it up by hand. But they all have weights, and you put the weights on the deadweight tester to match whatever scale you've got to add pressure to this. Now, it's not like a gym. This weight added 5 psi. Obviously, this thing doesn't weigh 5 pounds. The way we get away with that is the piston diameter in here is very, very small. So area times force, this amount of force over that tiny little piston is going to give me 5 psi of pressure. And that is how these work. They're strictly dependent on gravity. It is key that it is level, because if it's not level, that tiny little piston can get bound one way or the other and it won't respond the way it should. So it needs to be level. Other than that, this is actually one of my favorite standards. This is a standard. The only thing you have to do is make sure that you pick the right weights, make sure you've got the right scale, and make sure that the weights are not contaminated. We've got